Hello, scholars. My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we talked about the Roaring Twenties. In this video, we're going to cover the Great Depression. The increase in technology and the economic prosperity of the 1920s soon disappeared near the end of the decade. The 1930s would prove to be much different than the 1920s, and historians still debate what really caused the Great Depression. Many academics argue that the beginning of the Great Depression actually began in 1924. This is when consumer demand fell below factory production. In the beginning of the 1920s, consumer demand for automobiles and appliances were quite high. Factories could not keep up with this demand and had to hire additional workers to produce these items. In 1924, this changed as demand fell below factory production and continued to decline each year. With factories not selling the products they produced, they had to lay off workers. This meant those workers would no longer have the money to buy products, meaning more factories would have to lay off workers. This was a disastrous cycle that would continue to repeat itself through the 1930s. An imbalance between supply and demand was definitely one of the causes of the Great Depression, but the introduction of credit for Americans was probably another cause. In the late 1920s, Americans were obsessed with the stock market. The market had continued to rise so high, citizens never thought it was going to fall. Newspapers published stock averages on their front page because they knew they'd sell more papers if they did so. As the stock market climbed, Americans began borrowing money from banks and using it to invest in the market. Corporations also used their additional cash to invest, which left them open to the whims of the market. On October 24th, the stock market went from climbing to collapsing. This day became famously known as Black Thursday. When investors realized that stock prices were no longer stable, they began to panic and started selling as fast as they could. Banks and other crediting institutions turned to investors and demanded new collateral, which many could not provide. Banks not only lost in the market, but average Americans panicked and ran to their banks demanding any money they had stashed. Banks could only provide so much before they came up short. Some banks closed their doors and called on police officers to fend off angry crowds outside in the street. Those Americans that lost their money could no longer afford the products they had once bought. Then, even more factories had to shut their doors. This continued consistently for more than 4 years. When the early 1930s came, more than 25% of the workforce was out of a job. The rural areas did not do any better. In fact, they felt the Great Depression before those in the city did. World War I allowed American farmers the chance to produce crops, not only for American society, but for many European nations as well. After the war ended, Europe was still in ruins and crops were still important, but as European nations rebuilt, demand reduced substantially. Many historians believe that the agricultural shortages after World War I were the first cause of the Great Depression. No matter what the causes of the Great Depression, the decade led to physical and psychological damage that impacted every single American. Many Americans living in tenement housing lost their living spaces when they could no longer pay their rent. Families lived in lean-tos, which were often made of scrap metal or wood that didn't always hold up. Families turned to soup and beans to try to feed themselves and fill empty bellies. The poor stood in unemployment lines for hours hoping to receive a relief check, but nothing was guaranteed. Some families moved to the rural areas hoping it would be better, but it was worse than the city. Crops rotted in the fields because the cost of harvesting would be higher than letting them sit. African Americans and other minorities suffered the most during the Great Depression. 50% of these Americans were laid off as compared to 25% of whites. There was a saying amongst African Americans, "We are the first to be fired and the last to be hired." The only minorities that probably had it worse than Black Americans were Native Americans and Mexican Americans. Prejudice and discrimination was rampant during the Great Depression, and the government ended up deporting 500,000 Mexicans during this 10-year period. Those that were poor and survived the Great Depression definitely knew how to get through extremely difficult times. Americans would often stay in their beds long into the day, not only knowing how to stay warm, but how to hold on to as many calories as possible. They ate foods that contained sugars and fats, which would help to sustain energy in their bodies. Many Americans only heated their kitchens in hopes of saving as much money as they could. Those that were poor picked through the garbage and didn't mind eating scraps of food left by others. They didn't care where they got their calories from. The Americans that probably suffered the most psychologically were the white-collar workers. These individuals generally didn't have the knowledge on how to survive during difficult times and refused to ask for help when they desperately needed it. Men often left their families if they felt useless because they could no longer provide for them. Suicide was high amongst Americans during this time, but especially with the middle class. The rich believed that they suffered during the Great Depression, but they really didn't. They gave up former luxuries that they were used to having and complained about it, but knew they had it better than most. The rich only had a tough time when they saw other wealthy friends lose their businesses and become poor. They knew they could no longer associate with them. Herbert Hoover was president during the Great Depression, and he saw himself as the nation's cheerleader when the economy started to tank. He provided the American people with uplifting messages, which were okay at first, but angered the Americans as time continued. President Hoover told Americans that the Great Depression was the fault of European nations and their unstable economies. As more people lost their jobs and requests came for federal assistance, Hoover refused. Instead, he asked charities to help provide Americans in need. He also called for business leaders to come to the White House and ask them to keep their wages steady and to not drop their prices any lower. Business leaders agreed, but many of them went back on their word when their products sat on the shelves and didn't sell. Hoover again and again refused to help American people because he believed they didn't want handouts and that it would hurt their pride. As he gained more pressure from the American people, Hoover finally made a couple of changes and responded. Hoover created a farm board that could buy up surplus crops and directed various federal works projects like the Hoover Dam. He also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, which allowed the government to loan money to banks that were close to going out of business. President Herbert Hoover lost the respect of the American people when he instructed the military to clear out 22,000 veterans from Washington, D.C., that had come to Congress to try and collect their military bonuses that were promised to them in 1945. This group of veterans became known as the Bonus Army, and the Senate refused to provide them the money that they needed. Many veterans decided to stay in Washington, D.C. and constructed huts along the Potomac. When the military came in to clear the vets, they used tear gas and burned their huts, forcing them out of the area. Americans definitely had had enough of President Herbert Hoover and were going to show him this at the ballot box in the presidential election. Franklin D. Roosevelt won the Democratic nomination for president in 1932. FDR had grown up with wealth and had private tutors, took trips around the world, and was later educated at Harvard. FDR's mother helped him to gain a significant amount of confidence, and this stayed with him throughout adulthood, even as he battled polio. In the summer of 1921, Franklin Roosevelt got polio, and he fought as hard as he could. He suffered greatly and could never walk again in adulthood without assistance, but he didn't allow this to stop him. Many believe that polio helped him to understand the suffering of other Americans. FDR entered politics in the middle of the 1920s, and he was very dynamic. He had a deep and manly voice and a confidence that helped others to feel calm and inspired around him. FDR understood that politics meant cooperation, and he knew when to flatter people and when to lay down the law. FDR also knew how to use the media to his advantage and could easily win someone over if he had the time with them. When FDR ran against Hoover in the presidential election of 1932, he easily won with 472 electoral votes. It was very important to FDR that his first 100 days in office meant significant positive change for the American people. On March 4, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office while more than 13 million Americans remained unemployed. The most famous part of his speech that has been quoted over and over again in history is, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." At the conclusion of his inauguration, he called Congress into a special session and got right to work. FDR asked Congress to give him extensive executive power not given to any president before him. With this, he wrote new banking bills and presented them to Congress 5 days later, and the bills passed without any major glitches. On March 12th, FDR gave his first fireside chat on the radio to the American people in which he talked about this new banking legislation. FDR used a conversational tone that increased the trust of the American people and helped them to realize that he was in their corner. The new banking legislation would allow strong banks to reopen with federal support, and FDR assured the American people that their money would be safe. Banks that were weak would not be allowed to reopen, and those that were questionable would have to work with the federal government in order to be able to reopen. The next day, American citizens returned to the banks and placed their money back into the institutions. The fireside chat has been a success, and Americans were putting trust in their new president. For the next 90 days, FDR set about various initiatives to improve the U.S. economy. Congress backed him by creating legislation from these initiatives. FDR's initiatives eventually became known as alphabet soup to students who are studying American history. This is because each administration or association is abbreviated typically using 3 letters. The first of these 3 measures was called the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. The goal of this organization was to build dams, build roads, and set up electricity for those areas that didn't yet have it. Those that didn't like the TVA said the cost was too high and only certain parts of the nation benefited. This organization did help to bring the West and other rural areas into more of a modern era. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA, was another program that was launched by Roosevelt to work with businesses, labor, and the government to advance economic means. This would help business owners to help stabilize their prices and their production. Labor leaders helped to establish a minimum wage and a maximum amount of working hours to improve working conditions for its members. Those businesses and factories that worked with the NRA could display a stamp on their products of a blue eagle to show that everyone was being treated fairly. These were definitely good steps to help both businesses and workers, but it didn't go far enough. Workers could barely live off the wages of those that were provided by factories and businesses. In 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the National Recovery Administration to be unconstitutional. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, was another New Deal organization that was created in 1933. The AAA was effective at helping farmers to improve their circumstances. Henry A. Wallace was the Secretary of Agriculture and decided to pay farmers not to plant crops in certain areas of their field. They would receive subsidies or government payments for not planting within those areas. This would remove a large supply of crops, which would increase the prices that allow farmers to make a profit. This was the first time since World War I that farmers were able to make money off of their crops. Farmers that had more land tended to benefit the most from this program. Small tenant farmers and sharecroppers tended to be kicked off their land so their owners could gain profits for not planting anything. The Supreme Court also found aspects of the AAA unconstitutional, and the Congress was able to modify it in 1938 in order to keep it. The Farm Security Administration, the FSA, was an agency that was created to help tenants and sharecroppers gain their own land, but the agency was not successful and only provided loans to 2% of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, was distinctly President Franklin Roosevelt's idea and is probably one of the more popular New Deal programs from this era. This organization hired young and able-bodied men to plant trees, pave roads, create bridges, clear paths, and beautify the nation's public forest areas. The young men that were hired sent their earnings back to their families, which helped many families to survive. Evidence of the CCC's work still exists today. The Public Works Administration, PWA, was created in 1933 and was led by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. Ickes attempted to put people to work as quickly as possible, but he also wanted projects to be done extremely well, and because of this, not as many people secured employment as Roosevelt wanted. In the late months of 1933, the Civilian Works Administration, CWA, was created for the purpose of getting Americans working. Harry Hopkins led this organization and put 4 million Americans to work within very few months. Unfortunately, many of the workers that were hired did not know how to do the jobs that they were hired to do. Many of the projects were extremely poor in quality, but thousands of roads, playgrounds, and schools were built during this time. Americans needed to have money to help them through the winter, and the CWA helped them to do so. When Roosevelt observed some of the projects that had been done and how much they cost, he took away the CWA and it ceased to exist. Another popular New Deal program that was created in 1935 was the Works Progress Administration, WPA. The majority of those employed by the WPA took part in conservation and construction projects. The WPA also hired writers, actors, and artists in order to assist those with particular and unique talents. These talented individuals worked with the Federal Theater Project, allowing entertainers to produce plays, puppet shows, and music for populations of people that usually didn't get to see these types of performances. Even though the employees of the WPA did not earn tons of money, it helped them to survive until they could find work elsewhere. These are just a few of the New Deal programs that helped stimulate the economy of the U.S. during the 1930s. By 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt realized that his efforts had been productive, but they hadn't gone far enough to bring the nation out of a depression. FDR decided to initiate more revolutionary reforms, and in 1935, he helped to pass the Social Security Act. This was the first welfare system adopted in the U.S. to assist the elderly, the disabled, and those that became unemployed. This act was easily passed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Wagner Act was also passed in 1935, which established the National Labor Relations Board that supervised the relationship between management and labor and allowed collective bargaining with federal support. It became illegal to attempt to break apart unions, and when this act was passed, labor unions traveled the country to find members to represent. Along with the Wagner Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act was also passed. This act's purpose was to set minimum wages and a maximum number of hours a worker could labor per week. This bill eventually passed in 1938. At the time, the minimum wage was 40 cents an hour and the work week was 40 hours. More than 10 million workers received pay raises after this act was passed. FDR was an extremely popular president, and his wife was just as popular. Eleanor Roosevelt was an eloquent speaker and fought against racial discrimination for the rights of women across the U.S. Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins made sure that African Americans were hired by the WPA in 1939, and 1 million Black Americans gained employment through this organization. FDR also appointed many Black leaders to government positions in the executive branch. In the election of 1936, President Franklin D. Roosevelt won the election quite easily. FDR continued to gain the votes of the poor and the oppressed. The Democratic Party and its members significantly changed during this decade. The Republican Party became the party of those in rural areas and the wealthy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his popularity began to decline when he took on the Supreme Court, who had often struck down his agencies as being unconstitutional. FDR made claims that those justices on the Supreme Court had become too old and didn't really know what was going on in the world. The justices took great offense to this and became frustrated with FDR. FDR took it a step further by asking Congress to allow him the ability to appoint a Supreme Court justice for every justice that was over the age of 70 years old, up to 6 more justices. Democrats and Republicans weren't happy with this idea. Many saw this as Roosevelt's court-packing scheme. The Senate overwhelmingly blocked Roosevelt's dangerous idea. Within the year, one of the justices retired, allowing FDR to finally appoint someone younger to the court. Over the next 4 years, there were 4 more justices that exited the Supreme Court and were replaced with mostly younger individuals. Even though this issue worked itself out, Congress no longer had the same attitude toward Roosevelt that they did in the past. Year by year, the economy seemed to get better, and the New Deal programs created by President Franklin D. Roosevelt definitely played a big part in the success. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click that like button and don't forget to subscribe. I hope you had a great day, and I will talk with you soon.